Arthur "Artie" Wilson, 42 years old, is a cattle rancher from rural Queensland. He is hardworking, loyal, and trusted by his small community. Artie has always stayed true to his values, raised to prioritize family. He is the glue that holds the Wilson family together, but cracks in his own marriage are growing deeper. Clara Wilson, 38 years old, is Arthur's wife of 15 years. She is intelligent and beautiful. Clara works part-time as a nurse at a small-town clinic. Beneath her calm exterior, there is an inner restlessness, a longing for excitement and adventure that she's never fully admitted. Clara married young, and as the years passed, she started feeling confined by the routine of rural life. James "Jim" Wilson, 65 years old, is Arthur's father. A handsome man who, despite his age, has never lost his charm. Jim is a retired cattleman who once had the world at his feet. His confidence and charisma are captivating, and he's always been able to bend people to his will. Though he plays the role of a loving patriarch, deep down, his ego and selfish desires often guide his actions. When Jim suggested a trip to Alice Springs, Arthur didn't hesitate. His father was great at bringing the family together, pulling the reins when Arthur had been too focused on the ranch. It had been years since they took time off, and the financial pressures of the ranch had been wearing Arthur down. But Jim always knew when to step in and remind them to take a break from the grind. This trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, just Arthur, Clara, and Jim. For weeks, Clara had seemed distant. Arthur thought maybe the pressures of daily life had worn her down, the long nights working at the ranch, the unpredictable weather in Queensland, and the repetitive routine of outback life had drained any spark between them. They hadn't been intimate in months. Arthur wasn't the type to push, but he could feel her pulling away. In his heart, he thought the desert air might help them reconnect. He imagined the two of them under the stars, rediscovering the love they once had. They set off early in the morning for a long drive through the vast, barren landscape of Central Australia. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rugged, red earth. Arthur drove their old Land Rover. Jim sat in the passenger seat, and Clara sat in the back, silently gazing out the window. As always, Jim filled the air with his stories from the past when he was still running cattle through the outback, before his body started to slow down. His deep voice always commanded attention, and even now, Arthur admired his father's storytelling. But every so often, when Jim wasn't looking, Arthur noticed Clara smiling at him in a way that didn't feel quite right. It wasn't the warm, affectionate smile she used to give Arthur when they first met. It was something different, something that stirred an uncomfortable feeling in Arthur's stomach. The first night at the station was quiet. Arthur spent most of it tending to the fire outside, staring into the flames, wondering how he could fix things with Clara. He had tried talking to her, but she seemed distracted and distant, her mind somewhere else. Jim, on the other hand, was in high spirits, drinking whiskey and telling jokes as if nothing was wrong. Arthur went to bed early that night, feeling a strange unease, but pushing it aside. After all, Jim was his father and Clara was his wife. Family comes first, that's the Wilson way. The next few days passed uneventfully, but Arthur's sense of dread only grew. He noticed how Clara's eyes lingered on Jim a little too long when he spoke, and how they shared private jokes that Arthur wasn't part of. It bothered him, but he told himself he was overreacting. It was ridiculous. Clara wouldn't betray him, not with his own father. Yet, the distance between them seemed to widen with each passing day. One afternoon, while hiking with Clara and Jim through the rugged outback terrain, Arthur fell behind. His legs ached from the long trek, and he needed a moment to rest. Jim, ever energetic despite his age, offered to walk ahead with Clara. Arthur waved them on, wanting to catch his breath. Sitting on a large rock, Arthur watched them move further away. Their silhouettes blended into the desert landscape. He trusted both of them, but something about the way they moved together, so close, so comfortable, made him uneasy. He stood up and tried to shake off the feeling, pushing himself to catch up with them. That night, the tension became unbearable. After dinner, Clara and Jim sat by the fire, the golden glow highlighting their faces in the dim evening light. Arthur watched from the cabin, his heart heavy as he saw Clara laugh at one of Jim's jokes. It was a laugh that was different from the one she used to share with him, a laugh that cut through Arthur like a knife. He couldn't watch anymore. The uneasy feeling he'd been carrying for days became too loud to ignore. Arthur decided to step outside for some air and walked toward the fire, intending to join them. He stopped in his tracks when he saw it, Jim's hand on Clara's back, his fingers slowly tracing the curve of her waist. Clara leaned in closer, resting her head on his shoulder, her eyes closing in a moment of intimacy Arthur never could have imagined. It was as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. For a long moment, he stood frozen, watching them. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with 1,000 questions. How long had this been going on? How could they betray him like this? Clara. Arthur's voice cracked when he finally spoke. They both looked up startled. Clara quickly pulled away from Jim, her face flushed with guilt. Jim sat there, his usual confident grin wiped from his face, replaced by a look of shock. Arthur, I can explain, Clara started, but her voice faltered. Explain what? Arthur's voice rose, fueled by disbelief and anger. Explain how my own wife, with my father's. He shook his head, feeling the bile rise in his throat. Jim, ever the smooth talker, stood up slowly, hands raised in a placating gesture. Artie, mate, it's not what you think. Arthur felt his blood boil. Not what I think. Are you kidding me? His fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white. I trusted you, both of you. The silence that followed was unbearable. Clara stood there, eyes wide, tears already forming. Jim, for once, had nothing to say. The betrayal hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like the oppressive heat of the outback. Arthur stormed away from the fire, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't stay. He couldn't even look at them. The desert night was dark, but the stars above burned brightly, mocking the darkness now consuming his world. For hours, he wandered through the vast emptiness of the outback, trying to make sense of what had happened. How could the two people he loved most in the world have done this to him? By the time he returned to the cabin, dawn was breaking over the horizon. Clara was sitting on the porch, her face streaked with tears. Jim was nowhere to be seen. Arthur, please let me explain, Clara said, her voice trembling. There's nothing to explain, Arthur replied coldly. You made your choice, both of you. Clara stood up, her hands shaking. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I don't know what I was thinking. Jim, he was just there and we were drinking and it just happened. Arthur shook his head, his heart aching. You don't just happen to cheat on your husband, especially not with his father. Clara's tears fell harder now, but Arthur felt no sympathy. He had always prided himself on being a forgiving man, but this was too much. I'll pack my things, Arthur said flatly. I'm leaving. Arthur, no, please. I love you. We can fix this. We can go to counseling or something. I'll do whatever it takes. Arthur looked at her, feeling nothing but emptiness. How can you say you love me, Clara? If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You've destroyed everything. He walked past her and into the cabin, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He knew he couldn't stay, not with Clara, and certainly not with his father. He packed his things quickly, not bothering to take much. He just needed to get away. As he loaded his bags into the Land Rover, Jim finally appeared. He stood at a distance, his face etched with regret. Artie, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it, but I want you to know I'm sorry. Arthur stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. You're my father, Jim. You should have protected me, not betrayed me. Without another word, Arthur climbed into the car and drove away, leaving behind the life he had once known. The outback stretched out before him, vast and empty, much like the future that now lay ahead. Months passed, and Arthur slowly rebuilt his life. He moved to a neighboring town, far enough away from the ranch, so he wouldn't have to face Clara or Jim again. The divorce was messy, but Arthur didn't care about the details. He just wanted out. In time, he found a new sense of peace. He focused on his work, on the land, and on the friends who stood by him. Though the betrayal still haunted him, Arthur refused to let it define him. He had been broken, yes, but he wasn't destroyed. As for Clara and Jim, Arthur never saw them again. He didn't need to. The scars they left would never fully heal, but he had learned an important lesson. Trust, once broken, could never be fully repaired. But life goes on, and so would he. And so, Arthur left behind the ruins of a life once cherished. Walking away from the scars of betrayal, in the vast Australian outback, he found not just heartache, but the strength to start anew. Sometimes, it takes the breaking of bonds to rediscover the power of standing alone. Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts or questions about the story, feel free to ask in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of life, love, and the choices that define us.